MMOs are the greatest and worst genre in all of gaming. And I don't mean that sometimes they're the greatest and sometimes they're the worst, or that they simply have the potential to be both. No, MMOs are simultaneously the best and worst gaming has to offer. Nothing else out there has the capacity to fill you with so much joy, or so much disappointment, to enrich people's lives or ruin them, to let you fall in love or to break your goddamn heart. And I want to talk about that. Still, I also want you and everyone else on this planet to know exactly what this genre is all about, where it came from, and how it's changed. Ideally, if I had my way, this would be something taught in schools to children of all ages, so that future generations can better understand the folly of their elders. However, unfortunately, my influence is not at a level where I can enforce a global curriculum about the MMO genre, so this video will have to do instead. Which means, if you don't know anything about massively multiplayer online games, then today I will show you a world of infinite virtual possibilities and open your eyes to what some might say are some of the most important events in human history. And at the end, you will walk away saying, "Ah, I kind of get it now." And kind of get it you shall. And for those who do already know a little about MMOs, then through rich historical evidence and deep theoretical analysis, today I will expand your knowledge to never before seen heights, so that if that future day does come where MMO studies do become an important pillar of modern academia, you'll be ready. You're welcome. Now, important topics we will cover today include: where did MMOs come from? How did they flourish? When did things start to go wrong? That one game and why it mattered. That time when the media started comparing MMOs to hardcore drugs. What MMO will actually be the next big thing? That one time that guy said,
"You think you do, but you don't."
What depression would look like if it were a video game genre, and, of course, whether or not the MMO genre is, in fact, dead. And at the end of all this, I will also reveal how every single one of these things is connected. So, welcome to the history of MMOs. I hope you're paying attention. In order to understand the MMO genre, we must obviously start at where it all began, the first MMO. But what is the first MMO? Back before smartphones, before social media, before the turn of the millennium, before the internet was publicly accessible, and before any of Sony, Microsoft or Nintendo had ever made a gaming console, video games were barely even a thing yet. This dark time, also known as the 1970s, wouldn't last long, however, as just as Prometheus once stole fire from the gods to give to us lucky lesser mortals, so too did some brave pioneers take the early mainframe and mini-computers of the 1970s and start creating programs not for advanced computational functions, but just for fun. And yes, we do actually have to go this far back, because this will be important. You see, in 1972, we got the first video game, and you've probably heard of it. Pong looked like this, and yeah, that's pretty cool, I guess. If you're a fucking loser, I mean, what is this basic shit? How is anyone going to escape this mundane reality and forget all their problems with Pong? You know how you can tell Pong sucks? Its creators called it Pong. Good games are not called Pong, come on. No, you see, if you were stuck in the 1970s and you wanted the good stuff, text-based games. That was where it was actually at, and you can tell they were good because they had cool names like Adventure, Dungeon, and Zorg. And you know what else was cool about them? What you could do in them. These text-based games worked through typed user inputs and were heavily inspired by this little newly released, not video game but was catching on at the time, called Dungeons and Dragons. Now, comparing what you could do in these early text-based games to what you could do in, say, Pong, was a bit like comparing what you can see in an old Sears catalogue to what you can see on Pornhub. Basically, it's hardly the same type of experience. Still, you know what's cooler than exploring a dungeon in the video game Dungeon? Well, exploring a dungeon with friends. But oh no, we need a name. What could we call these multi-user dungeon-based games? Muds. They called them Muds. And hey, who said good games need good names? And so, hello, Fortnite, Roblox, Minecraft, League of Legends, Call of Duty, Halo, Quake, and every other online game ever invented. This is it. This is where it all started. The first MUD was, I guess, retroactively called MUD 1, and in it you could talk to and work with or against other players in a real virtual world, even if there weren't any graphics. Now, there's two important pieces of information I want you to write down in your metaphorical notebooks here. The first is that while the genealogy of MUD 1 to Fortnite is a bit vague and you'd be forgiven for forgetting that they're related, the lineage from MUD 1 to the MMOs you actually know the name of is a lot more direct, and the family resemblance can still clearly be seen. With familiar MMO concepts like party-based gameplay, loot, raiding, and even the Holy Trinity, all showing up in games like the highly popular 1990 Diku MUD. Also, many of the soon-to-be big names of the MMO world, like Brad McQuaid and Raph Costa, got their start in the industry as MUD developers. So, for MMOs, MUDs mattered. The second thing to take note of is the time frame. The first ever video game, Pong, was created in 1972. Meanwhile, MUD 1 was created in 1978, just 6 years later. This was 5 years before Google says the internet was invented, and so playing with other people back then meant you had to be a student or professor at a university which had its own internal intranet. At certain universities, these games would go on to become quite popular, with many people also sharing source codes between universities, meaning popular MUDs would have many different variants. But beyond that, there was literally no way for them to become more mainstream, and the popularity they did have mostly came through word of mouth. In fact, some of these early MUDs were created by students on the university networks in secret, and were then subsequently shut down when university staff found out they existed. I mean, typical goddamn kids, am I right? Always messing around, pioneering new billion-dollar industries, when they should be doing actual important stuff like memorizing textbooks. And that was the 1970s. Video games as a concept were new, and online games in particular faced many problems while having absolutely no way to commercialize and make money, and yet it didn't matter. The allure of playing with other real-life people in an online virtual world was so strong that people didn't need graphics, or the internet, or money to want to make that idea a reality. And so, the MMO dream was alive, pretty much as soon as it became theoretically possible. But was MUD 1, or even the later, more advanced Diku MUD, the first MMO? Well, not really. MUDs are MUDs, they are their own thing, and not only would they fail to meet most people's criteria for being massively multiplayer, they're also heavily defined by their text-based nature, something MMOs aren't. So, in summary, MUDs mattered, but our quest for the first MMO isn't over yet. So, what about the first online RPG with, more than just text? Well, if graphics are your thing, say hello to 1991's Neverwinter Nights. Not to be confused with BioWare's 2001 Neverwinter Nights, or the 2013 MMO Neverwinter. 1991 Neverwinter Nights was one of the Dungeons & Dragons Gold Box RPGs, and it ran on that same classic Gold Box engine. But Neverwinter Nights set itself apart by trying to incorporate the online multiplayer aspects seen in many MUDs into the Gold Box D&D formula to allow players to join the same party and each act individually in combat. Conceptually, this was a great idea. I mean, D&D was designed to be multiplayer. But as it was 1991, it did mean there was a little bit of a problem with players actually getting online in such a dark and distant time, such as the early 90s. And so, Neverwinter Nights was developed with the help of AOL, with the idea of an online game seeming attractive to AOL because back then people only seemed to be using the internet for silly, unimportant things like sending business emails. This was no good for AOL because they charged by the hour and all people were doing was logging on to download their emails and then logging off again, meaning the time users spent connected was minimal. So AOL needed a way to get people to stay logged in, and not realizing that what people most want the internet for is watching porn and arguing about politics, they went for the next best thing: online video games. And so, if you were a paying AOL customer in the early 90s, you too could step into its rudimentary take on the Forgotten Realms to do battle with monsters and dive into dungeons alongside your friends. And all for the cheap price of $6 per hour, which would be just over $12 if you factored in inflation. If anyone is watching this video while currently logged into an MMO, do me a favour and type /played into the chat for me, and then take your total hours and times that by 12. And hey, look, I guess monthly fees don't look so bad anymore. I like to think of this exercise as a nice reminder that no matter how bad monetization gets in modern games, things could still be worse. Although, don't tell that to Activision or EA, we wouldn't want them to get any new ideas. Also, while Neverwinter Nights did try to increase its player capacity over time, its servers were still far too small for the total player base, meaning people would often have to queue just to log in, and you'd still have to pay while queuing. Fun. So, $12 an hour, graphics like these, queues to log in, and very limited gameplay. Was Neverwinter Nights actually worth all that? Well, back in the 90s, for many people it was, and the player base grew to over 100,000 players before the game was eventually shut down in the late 90s. The message behind this seems clear. People wanted online games, even if they had to pay a premium to play them. And so, MMOs had officially arrived. Or had they? I mean, Neverwinter Nights was very impressive for its time, it did leave an important legacy in its wake, and it is often considered the first graphical MMORPG. But was this actually a massively multiplayer game? Well, that's up to your own definition. Originally, each server had a capacity of 50 concurrent players, which was later increased all the way up to 500, but for many people this still doesn't quite represent the moment MMOs were truly born. Neverwinter Nights was just a bit too early, too limited, too small, and it was still only available to paying AOL customers rather than all internet users. So, what was the first game to meet all possible criteria? The first game that actually fits the image we have of what an MMO should be? The first real MMO? Well, again, that's not exactly clear. By the mid-90s, online RPGs were starting to become more common and be accessible to broader internet users. Notable titles include 1996's The Realm Online and Meridian 59, as well as Nexus: The Kingdom of the Wind in Korea. Still, the first of these games to truly take the gaming world by storm, the game which would actually coin the term MMORPG and would prove the commercial viability of the genre beyond all doubt, was a game still played and loved to this day: Ultima Online. Released in 1997, Ultima Online was an offshoot to the long-running and hugely important Ultima series, one of the true pioneers of the computer role-playing genre. It was after the 8th mainline entry into the series that its creator, Richard Garriott, came up with the idea of creating an Ultima game where several thousand players could all participate in a shared fantasy world. Pitching this grand idea to the studio publisher, Electronic Arts, proved difficult, however, as at this time no previous online-only video game had went on to be a major commercial success. As such, Ultima Online took multiple attempts to get off the ground, and when it was finally given the green light, EA estimated, based off other titles in the market, that it would probably only achieve several thousand players, and so gave the project a development and marketing budget to reflect that. But Ultima Online didn't reach a few thousand players, it reached millions, with over 250,000 concurrent subscribers at its peak in the year 2000, making it both the fastest selling internet-only game of all time and the fastest selling computer game EA had ever produced. And these wildly successful sales were matched by the game's reception amongst its players. In an interview prior to release, Ultima creator Richard Garriott said that they wanted to make the very first ever completely virtual world for the mass public to go live out alternative lives in. And that's exactly what they did. Ultima Online was a different type of experience to many of the MMOs which would follow it, in that it was designed as a virtual world first and a game second. You see, Ultima didn't come with clearly defined pre-packaged goals for all players to follow. Instead, you had to make your own objectives. And the game wasn't about a race to max level, because it didn't even have levels. You progressed through a skill system where advancement was based on use, and which skills you chose to focus on were entirely up to the individual. And it wasn't a game about chasing the greatest loot, and there was no separation between end game and early game, and no one had even heard of dailies, time gating, or the meta. Instead, it was a truly open-ended, player-driven experience. Be who you want to be, and do what you want to do, and that includes non-combat activities too. So, if you wanted to live your life as a merchant, crafting your own wares and never even picking up a weapon, you could do that, and then build a house near a town to turn it into a shop, and then start advertising your wares to other players and making a name for yourself, and you would never feel like you're playing the game wrong or falling behind, because it was a virtual world before it was a game, and the point from its inception was just to allow players to live within its world. Of course, there can be a downside to so much freedom, as just like in real life, other people can kill you, and just like in real life, dying also kind of sucked, because people could take all your items and leave you needing to get someone else to come resurrect you. This was called PK, or player killing, and it was a defining part of the Ultima experience. Of course, killing people does come with consequences. Just like in real life, as if someone remembers your name and reports the murder, you can turn red to other players, meaning not only can other people freely attack you, but also NPC merchants might not sell you items anymore, and NPC guards might just stop protecting you, as well as other game-changing consequences, including players being able to pay gold to put a bounty on your head, which other players can then collect, providing they remember to cut your head off after killing you, as proof, that is. This created a complicated red versus blue dynamic of player killing outlaws on one side and innocent rule-abiding citizens on the other, and the opportunities for player creativity proved endless. You could steal items from players' houses, or use middlemen to kill on your behalf to avoid turning red yourself, or trick players through portals to teleport them out of town where it might be safe to kill them, or take to the seas to kill player fishermen and steal their boats to create your very own pirate empire, and so on. The most notable example of PKing occurred during one of the game's final beta tests, when Richard Garriott, as his in-universe character Lord British, an important figure across the entire Ultima series, was giving a speech to the player base when one player in the crowd used a fire field spell on him. As creator of the entire bloody series, and actual lord of the in-game realm of Britannia, Lord British was meant to be invulnerable to player attacks, and as such, Garriott had an invulnerability toggle to prevent things like this from happening. But it turned out this invulnerability status didn't persist between gaming sessions, and that day, down to nothing more than human forgetfulness, Garriott had simply forgot to toggle it back on after logging in, meaning the creator of the game and Lord of Britannia was assassinated, mid-speech, right there in front of a crowd of onlooking players. This event has come to be seen as highly symbolic of Ultima Online, as a passing of a torch moment from the developers, the ones who created this world, to the players, the ones who would control its future. And over time, the player base of Ultima Online proved so bloodthirsty and conniving that the developers eventually had to step in to create non-player killing servers with the release of the game's first expansion, Ultima Online Renaissance, which many criticised for fracturing the community and going against the spirit of the game. Ultima Online also had its own problems that came from being the first online game of this scale, including how to actually get money from players, as while a monthly subscription was decided on as the best financial model, most people outside of America didn't have credit cards yet, meaning the developer needed to start selling game time as something you could physically purchase at retail stores in order for most people outside of America to be able to actually play. An even bigger problem came with how to actually deal with all these players. Ultima Online's world was truly massive by the standards of the era, with a capacity of 2,500 simultaneous players, but after the unprecedented level of interest since the first beta, it became clear that even this wouldn't be enough. The solution was to split the game's population into multiple different identical servers, which would each host their own persistent copy of the game's world. So, when you created a character, you would do it on one specific server, and that would be the only server where your character would exist. This was something the developers were at first hesitant to do, as it went against the original idea of creating a true virtual world, but after the large amount of interest in the beta, it became clear that it was going to be necessary for the developers to have any chance of coping with the large player base. In fact, the decision to split the player base into different servers was seen as something so significant that it was incorporated into the game's story, with it being explained that after the main character of the single-player Ultima series shattered the gem of immortality at the end of Ultima 1, he discovered that it was tied to the world itself, leading to a number of different identical shards being created, each a replica of the same world of Britannia. This narrative explanation was even designed to allow the possibility of these shards one day being reunited to bring all players back into a single world if the technology did one day allow it. Alas, this never happened, and MMO servers went on to become a normal and very important part of the MMO experience. Still, problems with servers, lack of credit cards, rampant player killing, and Garriott's infamous assassination didn't change the fact that Ultima Online was a huge success. It proved beyond doubt the commercial and technical viability of this type of game, and people still play Ultima Online to this day. And so, with Ultima Online's ascendancy, the MMO genre was born. This is the end of Lesson 1, although don't worry, we still have a long way to go. Before that though, if there is one single thing to take away from the story so far, it's not just that these early MMOs and proto-MMOs were successful despite the hurdles of the era in which they were made, it's why they were successful. You see, even if there were no graphics, even if there was no internet, even if you were greatly limited in what you could do in these games, even if you had to pay $12 per hour to play them, and even if the developers had to write the rules of how to actually make these types of games as they went, none of that was enough to change the fact that people wanted these games, even if they had to queue to play, pay by the hour, and put up with losing all items on death. And I think this all comes down to one simple reason, which is that MMOs were more than just online games. They were virtual worlds. You can look at these early games and wonder how anyone could ever enjoy them as a result of their rudimentary graphics, but I would argue that what truly makes a world feel alive isn't how it looks at all. Instead, it's two things. The first is that it's filled with real people, and the other is that it persists even when you're not around. Most offline games have neither of these. Their worlds exist only when the player is there with them, and no matter how realistic they might look, they're filled with obviously unreal characters whose level of artificial intelligence doesn't even come close to that of an actual person. And this sense of fakeness can make your actions feel more meaningless. But for MMOs, it's different. Their worlds are filled with real people, and player actions do have actual long-term consequences, and this can make them feel more real, which can make everything you do within these games seem more meaningful as a result. This is why players might put up with bad graphics, or carry out time-consuming and repetitive tasks, or just dedicate large parts of their lives to them. The appeal MMOs provide is unique, and if this is something which appeals to you, it's something you can't just find somewhere else. Of course, there's nothing wrong with this not appealing to someone. After all, there's no reason you need to believe in a virtual world when one reality can be more than enough. But if you want to understand MMOs, you need to understand this side of them. They're not just games, and few titles exemplified that better than the father of the genre itself, Ultima Online. And that brings us to the end of Lesson 1. Now, I hope everyone has been keeping up. Don't worry too much if you didn't take good notes. I will of course be making this and all future lessons available online, and if anyone has any questions, just shout them out. I don't mind. Because I can't hear you. Now, on to Lesson 2. With Ultima Online's release, MMOs had officially arrived, and in the following years, the genre would continue to grow as both developer interest and player access to the internet increased. Ultima Online's financial success was also significant because of the monthly fees users were paying, where 100% of that fee was going straight to the game's creators, unlike with physical sales where game retailers of the time might take a cut of up to 50% of all sales. In a time before microtransactions, these fees were very lucrative and presented an almost unrivaled opportunity for profits, and so big-name publishers like Sony, Microsoft, Square Enix, Ubisoft and others became more willing to take a chance and finance their own MMOs. The first to be released in the West was EverQuest in 1999, and if Ultima Online could be considered the father of the genre, EverQuest has a strong claim to being its mother, due to both its groundbreaking popularity and the strong influence it had on many titles that would follow. Where Ultima Online had taken inspiration from the Ultima RPG series and prioritized player freedom, EverQuest instead took inspiration from the text-based mods of earlier, which several of its designers had previously worked on, leading to a focus on player cooperation. The primary way it achieved this was through difficulty. Basically, EverQuest was hard, and that made people want to play with each other so they could work together to overcome the challenges its world presented. But cooperation was also encouraged through certain design choices. Take dying, which had long been an intimidating concept in MUDs and other early MMOs, and EverQuest was no different. On death, you lost experience points, possibly up to an hour's worth of grinding, and you also dropped all the items and equipment you had on you. You then needed to run to your corpse, naked, from wherever you set as your home location, and if you didn't get there in time, you risked losing everything you previously had on you. But if there was someone around who could res you, like a party member, guild mate, or just a kind passerby, then they could bring you back to life on the spot, saving you from a dangerous corpse run and reducing the XP loss you would suffer. By today's standards, these kinds of harsh death penalties might seem barbaric and not fit for modern society, but they were very effective at making people grateful for the help of others, and at making those doing the helping feel valued because their actions had such a large positive impact. Other examples of challenge leading to cooperation can be seen in EverQuest's actual quests, which were both hard to find and hard to complete, meaning players were basically forced to share knowledge with each other. Or in the lack of a map, meaning players had to rely on each other to find their way around the world. Or in the lack of an auction house, meaning you needed to interact directly with people to trade items and rely on others to acquire certain important things. The question of whether these punishing inconveniences were worth the added social benefits they brought is largely up to each individual, but one can't deny these inconveniences did have a social benefit. And the idea of working together was also heavily incorporated into EverQuest's class design. Some semblance of the Holy Trinity can be seen in earlier MUDs, but it was EverQuest which really cemented its place at the forefront of MMO game design. For those unaware, the Holy Trinity refers not to the Father, Son and Holy Spirit, but instead to the three primary roles players often take in group combat. These are the tank, the healer, and the DPS, or damage dealer, and each has their own job to perform. The tank draws enemy attention, usually referred to as aggro, to protect the rest of the party. The healer heals incoming damage to keep everyone alive, and the damage dealer, or damage per second, just does as much damage as possible to kill any and every enemy. Usually groups have one tank, one healer and several DPS, although as group size increases, more tanks or healers can start to be required, and the idea is that through working together with specialised roles, the group can increase their overall effectiveness. Not every MMO that would follow EverQuest would feature the Holy Trinity, but a lot did, and it's a concept most MMO players are very familiar with. Still, something not all MMO players are familiar with are some of the other roles players might take in groups in EverQuest, like Buffer, Crowd Controller, and Puller, who was the person with the responsibility for pulling enemies towards the party. EverQuest also had multiple dedicated support classes, like the Bard or Enchanter, who would take a role completely outside the classic Holy Trinity and were only there to make their allies more effective. The result was a game where everyone had their own specific role to play in combat, and working together was hugely important. And while these roles may not have been completely necessary when killing normal enemies to level up, EverQuest also popularised something else that has become synonymous with the MMO genre: raiding, where these different roles did become necessary. If you've never heard of raiding, then think of it as challenging group-based content that usually requires a large group of coordinated players, often playing for an extended period of time to kill enemy bosses and collect the best items or loot in-game. As EverQuest was such an early MMO, you may assume raiding in it would be easy, but if that's what you're thinking, you clearly haven't been paying attention, because EverQuest wasn't really a big fan of easy. And so not only did enemy raid bosses do a large amount of damage, they also had specific mechanics players had to overcome, like special attacks players had to move out of, as well as hazards in the boss arena, like traps players could fall into, as well as other nearby enemies players could accidentally get too close to and end up pulling into the fight. And if all that sounds fairly standard for an MMO, each boss in EverQuest could also take over an hour to kill, and far longer was needed to clear the boss area of other enemies beforehand, buff up every player, and coordinate everyone's complicated roles in order to actually take the boss down successfully. Oh, and there also weren't any instances in EverQuest, meaning all bosses exist in the game world, and if you wanted your group to be the one to kill it, you had to camp its location so you get to it before anyone else when it respawns. In a time when raiding was a new concept, EverQuest's hardest encounters could pose a serious challenge, and only the best players had a chance of defeating them. And it's something no one could do alone. Raiding, in EverQuest or otherwise, was and is all about who you play with. So, if you wanted to get anywhere in EverQuest, from raiding to leveling, you were going to need to group up and work with others. It was simply the way the game was designed, and many other games of this era followed this group or die philosophy. Outside of this, much of EverQuest's DNA was shared with Dungeons & Dragons, something that can be seen easily in its good, neutral and evil alignments, or its recognisable main stats, although the number of different classes and races, as well as the size of its in-game world, do still feel impressive to this day. And so were its sales, as in just a few months it would surpass Ultima Online's already significant player base, reaching a peak of 550,000 concurrent subscribers, far above any other Western MMO at the time. EverQuest would be followed in late 1999 by another MMO, Asheron's Call. Together with Ultima Online, this triumvirate is sometimes referred to as the Big Three for their collective role in popularising MMOs in the West, although Asheron's Call achieved considerably less sales than its two previously mentioned compatriots. This didn't stop it from acquiring its own loyal player base, however, and it stood out for its highly skill-based combat system, which was more action-focused than the games which preceded it, and incorporated real collision detection with a heavy focus on aiming and movement. Alongside the ability to kill other players and acquire some of their items, similar to in Ultima Online, this led to a heavy focus on player killing, with communities and player-based factions forming to support this. Outside of this, Asheron's Call is also significant for the vast size of its in-game world, which was entirely seamless, with no loading screens or separation between zones, as well as the way it told its story, which happened through in-game playable events that were released monthly and could be shaped by the community's actions. One of the most famous of these events was the Shard of the Herald, where players were tasked with destroying several in-game shards, only to find out upon the destruction of the final shard that this would actually summon a legendary demon to the world. However, as no one originally knew what would happen when the shards were destroyed, it led to a split in the player base between those who wanted to destroy them against those who wanted to protect them. To aid in the story, the developers jumped in game to take the role of powerful NPCs who bribed certain players with the promise of high-level items to destroy the shards in the name of a demon, thus continuing the planned story. And so that's what ended up happening. Except on one server, Thistledown, where the defenders actually managed to resist. To do this, they set up 24-hour protection, working together in shifts to successfully guard the final shard, until the developers once more stepped in to take a more active role by summoning high-level monsters to finally force the shard's destruction. Still, in return for their efforts, the defenders were immortalized with an in-game statue bearing their names to forever commemorate their valiant defiance. This example does a great job at illustrating the potential for unique storytelling provided by a living world, where players can play an active role in evolving events, and where developers can even get involved too by taking on a role similar to that of the Dungeon Master in a Dungeons & Dragons game. My favourite example of this type of developer interaction has to be in 2005's relatively short-lived and averagely reviewed MMO, The Matrix Online, and while I'm sure this game did have its problems, one of which being how weird the combat looked, its narrative was still very unique. The Matrix Online was set immediately following the conclusion of the original trilogy of movies, with the inhabitants of the Matrix, which were the players, now suddenly realizing the truth behind their simulated reality. Basically, the story said, what would happen if loads of people in the Matrix suddenly realized their world was fake, after the machine's defeat? And then instead of the writers trying to create a specific answer, they just let the players be the world's inhabitants, almost like a simulation of this event, rather than a traditionally scripted story. Which, in this example, works perfectly, as the difference between an MMO player in a virtual game world isn't that different to a Matrix inhabitant in a simulated reality world. This concept even had the series' co-creators' blessing, with the Wachowski siblings saying the players would be able to inherit the original storyline as their own. Anyway, The Matrix Online was shut down in 2009, so wow, players, you really fucked that one up, didn't you? Still, before that, The Matrix Online had a dedicated group of developers called the Live Events team, who would be paid to log in and act out the role of specific characters during certain story events, including pre-established characters like Morpheus. So, in most games where you might get a quest from an NPC, in The Matrix Online, that quest giver might have been an actual developer. As you can probably imagine, this type of in-game direct developer or game master interaction has become almost unheard of as time went on, and so have live interactive story events, probably due to the problems they create with servers being overloaded when such events inevitably bring too many players into a single location. Still, despite The Matrix Online's problems, its method of storytelling was admirable, although I guess a game from 2005 is getting a little ahead of ourselves. You see, despite covering the so-called big three of the early MMO world, one cannot simply leave the 90s behind without talking about another important game. One that would quickly go on to be bigger than all of the big three combined and would continue to have millions of players from its launch right up to this very day, albeit mostly in Korea. Inspired by old-school roguelike NetHack, with gameplay reminiscent of Diablo, Lineage exploded into the Korean PC-dominated gaming market in 1998 and never quite left, with a more recently released mobile port titled Lineage M still bringing in billions of dollars of revenue. In addition to its hardcore player-versus-player combat and its, for the time, innovative in-game guild system, Lineage is best known for putting a heavy focus on grinding, with a philosophy that has come to be synonymous with Korean MMOs, where grinding isn't something that supplements other parts of the game, but instead, grinding is the game. To understand why Lineage was quite as successful as it was isn't that easy to do, as its success never really spread much beyond Korea, and also soon led to many other Korean MMOs with similar visual and design styles, sometimes referred to as Lineage clones. However, it may help to think of it this way, which is that while outside of Korea, Lineage was seen as just another Korean MMO, within Korea, Lineage was the MMO, and its legacy can still be seen in new Korean MMOs to this day. But Korea wasn't the only Asian country helping to shape the MMO genre. In late 90s Japan, the personal computer gaming market was still struggling to find life, but the console market was growing like never before. And so, after playing several Western online games, including Ultima Online, Diablo and EverQuest, Sega chairman Isao Okawa came to the conclusion that the internet was tied to the future of gaming, leading to the creation of the first ever console MMO, Phantasy Star Online, which released on the Dreamcast in the year 2000. Due in part to its console limitations, alongside the inspiration it took from Diablo, Phantasy Star Online was a lobby-based game where players would form groups of up to 4 players to explore different variants of 4 different dungeons. Compared to the freedom of Ultima Online or the complexity of EverQuest, Phantasy Star Online may have admittedly been more limited, but this also had the advantage of making it more accessible to its console audience, and it quickly found a dedicated audience in its home market of Japan, making it the first ever MMO to do so. And despite not being quite so massive as its compatriots, Phantasy Star Online still retained a focus on the social aspects of the genre, with a trading system that forced players to trade between themselves as the only means to acquire certain important items, and with an automatic translation system that would display many key phrases in multiple different languages so that players from different parts of the world could still communicate and play with each other all on the game's one single global server. This idea of bringing different people together would be taken even further by another Japanese MMO, Final Fantasy XI, which released in 2002. Taking heavy inspiration from EverQuest, Final Fantasy XI once more placed a large focus on needing to group with other players to progress, following the design idea that it would be a game about a group of adventurers coming together to form a party, just like in a classic Final Fantasy game, except this time all the adventurers would be players. As such, group-based cooperation was at the centre of many of the game's systems, like its skill chain system, which granted players bonus effects by forming combos with other party members in combat. Likewise, death was once more punishing, involving losing a significant amount of experience points, and the world was designed to be dangerous, to force players to need to group together to overcome its challenges together. Still, where Final Fantasy XI truly stood out was how it took Phantasy Star Online's global interconnected approach to its player base even further, as not only did it also feature global servers and an automated translation system, but also, for the first time for an online game, it was also cross-platform and eventually cross-console. And so, whether you played on PC, PlayStation or Xbox, in Europe, America or Asia, everyone could still play together. This wasn't the only way MMOs were becoming more accessible, however, as in England, a game which would receive multiple iterations and go on to shape a whole generation of adolescents' online lives, was to be first released to the public in 2001 under the name RuneScape. And while it didn't become a global gaming phenomenon overnight, it didn't take long. Mostly for one simple reason, which was that anyone could play it. RuneScape was a free-to-play game, fully playable with just a web browser, which meant the traditional costly barriers to entry of paying for a physical game, a monthly subscription, and an expensive gaming-capable PC weren't standing in players' ways, and so many people, particularly younger players, were able to step foot into a virtual online world for the first time. And while the graphics may have been basic, its game design wasn't. Taking inspiration from earlier MUDs, with an open-ended, player-driven design similar to that seen in Ultima Online, RuneScape allowed thousands of players to level up skills and complete quests in whatever order they chose. For some, it would be the start of their MMO addiction. For some, it would be the start of their RuneScape addiction, and for some, it was just a taste of what was out there and might be to come. But regardless, few games in history have had such a large impact on a particular generation of gamers, and through two very different versions of the game, RuneScape continues to thrive to this day. Still, accessibility wasn't the only way the MMO genre was evolving, as 2001 would see another significant release in Dark Age of Camelot. With a smaller development team and lower budget than some of its rivals, Dark Age of Camelot had its work cut out for it to compete in the now blooming MMO landscape, and this was only furthered by its developers' struggle to secure a publisher. Still, Dark Age of Camelot nevertheless did compete, and it was all thanks to the focus on a new type of competitive play: PvP. Using the source material of Arthurian legend, a decision made due to it being in the public domain and so free to use, Dark Age of Camelot divided its player base into 3 distinct factions or realms, all vying for control of a mythical Camelot after the death of King Arthur. Players would then work with members of their own faction to fight against players from the 2 enemy factions in player vs player combat. PvP would go on to be a staple of the MMO genre, and it did exist before Dark Age of Camelot in the form of player killing, or PK, but this was the first time an entire game was designed around the idea, as where other MMOs saw rampant player killing as a problem, and in time tried to prevent or curtail it, Dark Age of Camelot instead thoroughly embraced the player base's natural tendency to want to kill each other, and offered it to them on a scale unseen before in the genre. To this end, the long-running tradition of harsh penalties for player deaths was relaxed, as the developer wanted players to put themselves in harm's way for glory of the realm. Likewise, supporting systems, like crafting, were incorporated into the broader realm vs realm conflict, like by allowing players to craft vital PvP items like siege equipment or ammunition, and rewards were also given to those who were victorious, with guilds being able to claim and hold territory, and entire realms gaining bonuses for capturing and holding valuable relics. The result was a game many players consider to be the pinnacle of large-scale player-versus-player gameplay, and this was reflected in Dark Age of Camelot sales, as it went on to achieve the second highest subscriber count of any MMO in the West, only surpassed by EverQuest. The key to this success, despite the game's relatively modest budget, may be due to the fact that it was less reliant on its developers to continuously create new content for its players to engage with, because in a PvP-focused game, the players are the content, and all the developers needed to do is give them a reason to want to keep killing each other. And so, players fought not only for rewards, but for pride, and glory for their guilds, and a fierce loyalty to their realm. And through this endless conflict, bonds were forged as success in combat still relied on grouping up with other players to maximise effectiveness. And if player versus player, or even medieval fantasy wasn't for you, the early 2000s would also see the rise of many new settings and styles of games as the MMO genre continued to grow year on year. Some examples to reflect this growing diversity include 2001's sci-fi MMO Anarchy Online, set in a distant 29,000 AD, or 2002's 2D sprite-based Korean MMO Ragnarok Online, or 2003's entirely space-based MMO EVE Online, set in a single shared game world that spanned 7,800 visitable star systems, or 2004's City of Heroes, a superhero-based MMO with some of the deepest and most expressive character creation in video game history. And with new settings also came big names. For example, 2003's Star Wars Galaxies offered players the chance to do something many people around the world had dreamed of for years, a chance to step into the universe of Star Wars and just live there for a bit, something Star Wars Galaxies in particular excelled at due to its Ultima Online inspired open-ended design principles and focus on non-combat focused professions like the trader or entertainer that, alongside a detailed and highly customizable player housing system, could lead to entire player-created cities full of useful facilities and businesses that gave other players a reason to visit. Of course, for almost all of these games, the core activities players actually did in them were to some degree repetitive, basic, and possibly unfulfilling from a gameplay perspective. In an IGN review from 2001, they described the average MMO combat as boring, hit button and go get a drink while the monster dies. As, even as far back as 2001, a stereotype existed of MMOs being tedious, even during their most action-packed segment like the combat, where you often had to just watch your character perform auto-attacks until the enemy ran out of hit points. But combat wasn't the only thing that could take a while. You also had to wait around to find groups, spend a lot of time waiting to get to your destination when travelling, kill large numbers of similar enemies to level up, which might require waiting around for enemies to respawn or for your character to regain health or mana, and so on. You could say the MMO genre didn't really value the player base's time, and when you consider that this genre was primarily funded through monthly subscriptions, meaning there was an incentive to give players things to do and make them take as long as possible to prevent people from running out and unsubscribing, there is some merit to this idea. Still, for many players, it didn't matter that what you did in these games was sometimes boring, because the MMO dream of creating real virtual worlds was so alive within these games, and for the right person, nothing was more exciting than that. And hopefully, with the examples in this segment, you can start to see that. Like how playing through massive player-driven story events in Asheron's Call, or creating huge alliances and participating in actual wars against other realms to conquer land in Dark Age of Camelot, or creating actual cities complete with taxes, player-voted mayors, and server-famous bars and cantinas in Star Wars Galaxies, can make these games more than games. And hell, back in the early 2000s, the entire concept of an online game was still pretty novel. Halo 2 is often considered one of the most important online games of all time. It played a hugely important role in normalizing online gaming, and being able to play Halo multiplayer with other people over Xbox Live was seen as a truly revolutionary and groundbreaking moment for gaming consoles. And Halo 2 released in late 2004. Now, I don't want to imply that Halo 2 multiplayer wasn't good, but it wasn't an entire virtual world for players to live a second life in. It's also worth considering that MMOs predate social media. When I was a teenager, people at school used MSN Messenger to talk to each other over the internet after school, and this was the main thing many people did for fun in their free time. Which makes some sense, as this was before smartphones and texting was still expensive and things like Facebook didn't exist yet, so any program that allowed you to simply chat with people was seen as pretty incredible. But MMOs predated MSN Messenger, and they also allowed you to talk to other people over the internet, as well as so much more. And so, the early to mid-2000s were a true golden age for MMOs, both for the players who were getting to experience the thrills of these virtual worlds for the first time, and for the genre itself, which was seeing growth in both the number of games available and in the total number of subscribers playing these games. This was a time when the rules of the genre were still being written, when exciting new titles were always just over the horizon, and when no one really knew what they were actually doing in these games, making the experience arguably more enjoyable as a result. Most of all though, it was a time when the future seemed bright. Every year was producing rapid advancements in both graphical and processing power within gaming, and if these kinds of huge, expansive and realistic worlds were possible now, just imagine what they would be like in 5 or 10 years' time. And if the MMO player base was large now, it would surely only grow as each year saw an increase in the number of people with access to gaming-capable PCs, and with access to the internet, and with access to higher speed broadband connections. And so, the future seemed full to the brim with promise and potential, all just waiting for something to come along and ignite it. For a spark to create a flame that would set the whole world ablaze. I genuinely believe a strong argument can be made that World of Warcraft is the single most important game ever made. Because, sure, when it comes to the total number of players, even World of Warcraft's peak of 12 million subscribers is still just a fraction of what many popular modern free-to-play games pull in, and in terms of historical significance on the industry, World of Warcraft is obviously behind the likes of your Pac-Men, Tetrises and Super Mario Bros. But if you were instead to consider importance like an equation, where total impact equals the number of people who played it times the impact it had on each individual person, then even if World of Warcraft has less total players than other games, the average impact it had on each one is so astronomically larger than most other games that in terms of total impact, I really think World of Warcraft might be the single greatest of all time. Still, where exactly World of Warcraft ranks amongst the most important games of history really doesn't matter right now, because its importance to the MMO genre is truly beyond question. Here are a couple of graphs with some of the most accurate historical data we have available of past MMO subscription numbers, showing WoW's subcount relative to the other biggest titles. Keep in mind those other two green lines, the next highest on the graph, are also World of Warcraft, just with East and West being split, and the other games you see here often have other factors involved, like being browser-based or just being really popular in Asia. Anyway, as the graph shows, WoW was pretty big, but to see how big, you need to zoom in, and keep zooming, and zoom a little bit more, and then look at the other popular MMOs that would be here if they were large enough to even make it onto this graph. So here is another graph which shows the under 1 million subscriber club to put things into perspective. And yeah, there's a bit of a difference. I mean, wow, Warhammer Online, 800,000 active subscribers. That's really impressive. At your absolute peak, you managed to have about 1/15 of World of Warcraft's numbers, and it looks like you only managed to keep that up for about a month before accidentally managing to walk off a massive fucking cliff. Oh dear, what have we got here? Shut down in 2013. But hey, at least you can always tell your grandchildren about the good old days where for about a month you managed to have 1/15 as many players as World of Warcraft. So, the numbers speak loud enough on their own, but it wasn't just numbers. World of Warcraft was also the game which brought MMOs into the broader public consciousness. From TV adverts with celebrities telling you about their characters, to fear-mongering mainstream news segments, to legitimate academic papers on gaming addiction, and even the now iconic South Park episode, WoW took the genre mainstream and in doing so cemented much of the knowledge we have of the genre today, from negative player stereotypes to actual design principles other games would copy. World of Warcraft basically defined what it meant to be a massively multiplayer game in the eyes of the public, and suddenly MMOs were something many people now knew about. The end result was that MMO players came to be thought of as complete losers, and MMOs themselves came to be seen as either so real or so fun that playing them carried a significant risk of getting addicted and ruining your entire goddamn life. And honestly, there was at least some truth to both of these. I mean, most people at the time probably had at least heard about someone who had quit their job or dropped out of college to play WoW, which society tended to regard as a rather poor life choice. Still, the primary question we need to cover in this lesson are the whys. Why did World of Warcraft gain so many players? Why did people enjoy it so much? And why did it gain a reputation of ruin and addiction so extreme that to an outsider it sounds not quite so dissimilar to that of a Class A illicit drug? Well, allow me to explain. Firstly, World of Warcraft did have a few things going in its favour when it first released. After all, by 2004, reliable internet access had become more common, and by this point, existing MMOs had already created a passionate MMO player base who were hungry for new games. And also, back before they were known for office-based sexual misconduct, Blizzard actually had a bit of a reputation for making really good games, and they also tended to be PC games with large online components, making Blizzard's audience exactly the type of people a new MMO would want to target. But these alone don't explain WoW's monumental success. I mean, it's not like the Warcraft series was bigger than, say, Star Wars. No, the biggest reasons were that WoW had two vitally important things going for it. The first was that it was fun, and the second was that compared to the games which came before, World of Warcraft was accessible. This was a game where you could play and level up all the way to the maximum level completely on your own, and where dying only led to a short walk to your corpse and no XP or item loss, and where quests were signposted with markers showing where to pick them up and then guided the player where to go to complete them. And those quests were also plentiful and were able to replace the repetition of grinding out kills on the same mobs hours on end as the primary way to level. And it also reduced a lot of the waiting around the genre was known for, both in and out of combat. It even ran smoothly on relatively average PCs, making its potential audience even larger. And you can easily find evidence for all of this in reviews of the time, with almost all of the changes WoW brought being warmly received by critics. Still, with the benefit of hindsight, You could also argue that WoW didn't go too far with these changes so as to harm many of the things important to the genre. For example, playing solo was an option, but it was at times difficult and players were still rewarded and incentivized to group up as well. Or how death wasn't highly punishing, but the world still felt very dangerous, particularly on a PvP server, meaning the leveling experience still felt regularly challenging and engaging. Or how character building still had depth, it just wasn't overwhelmingly complex, and so on. It was as if World of Warcraft had found some sweet spot between challenging and accessible that would truly appeal to a wide range of people. And it might have also found a sweet spot with the era it released in, as while old MMOs were known for being large with lots of races, classes and zones, this would actually come to change over time as development costs for all games would increase alongside the ever higher technical demands of game development, and so it became typical of MMOs released after WoW to be noticeably smaller. But World of Warcraft itself seemed to combine the quantity of content from older MMOs with the higher quality of future ones. For example, it had 8 different playable and distinctive races, 9 classes, and a staggering 40 different zones, all part of a seamless world which players could travel across with no loading screens, and all delivered with really high production values, from its now iconic colourful fantasy aesthetic to its memorable soundtrack, or even its evocative debut trailer. So, World of Warcraft basically had all the needed ingredients to be a massively successful game, and the thing about success is that it tends to snowball, just like a viral video on YouTube, or a rich person's bank account, or an infectious disease amidst vulnerable populations. After all, how many people first played World of Warcraft because their friend told them to? I mean, every person you infect increases the speed the disease spreads, and World of Warcraft was very good at infecting people. So, let's look at that part of the game. In the previous lesson, I talked about a few of the more unique features of past MMOs, which made their worlds feel real. Things like playable story events, large-scale faction-based conflict, and in-depth player housing. And World of Warcraft did have those things. Except for the player housing, which every successful MMO seems to have, except World of Warcraft. Anyway, it had the other things, but none of them were what World of Warcraft was really known for or where it excelled relative to its peers. To understand that, you need to understand a new concept, which is that outside of the appeal of a virtual world and the social elements inherent to them, there is another thing MMOs do better than other games, and which MMO players seem to enjoy, and that's progression. You see, when you finish a single-player game, it's over, and all your actions no longer have any meaning outside of the enjoyment they provided in the moment. But when it comes to MMOs, they're not designed to be finished. So, in an MMO, there is always more to do, and the player is always getting stronger, improving their gear or collecting new things, and each bit of progress you make has the potential to have meaning long into the future, giving it a greater sense of importance and making its attainment potentially more enjoyable. The easiest to understand form of progression is leveling up. At level 1, you're weak. You have hardly any abilities, and most content in the game is unavailable. Every time you level up, however, your character gets a little stronger. More abilities are unlocked, and more types of content open up to you. And sometimes there are even major milestones to incentivize your progress that all players will come to look forward to. For example, in World of Warcraft, when you reach level 40, you are able to learn to ride a mount, making the speed you traverse the world much faster, and the positive impact this has on your in-game life can immediately be felt. It's just like passing your driving test and getting your own car. Suddenly, that McDonald's drive-thru is basically just around the corner, and that quarter pounder with cheese has never tasted better. And you know why it tastes so good? It's because you earned it. You put in the time to learn to drive. You saved up the money for your piece of shit car, and you leveled all the way to 40 on foot while getting killed every time you ran into a higher level member of the opposite faction, and this is your reward. And goddamn does it feel good. Progress is fun, and that's probably just the way our brains developed. I mean, it does make sense to give the stupid human a nice dopamine rush after spending 5 hours hunting an antelope, because we wouldn't want anything awkward to happen like the species accidentally going extinct. But now we don't hunt antelopes. Instead, we sit in classrooms trying to absorb abstract lessons, or we turn up to the office and answer emails all day as just one small cog in an incomprehensibly oversized machine. And sure, technically we're still making progress, but it can be a little hard to see at times. I mean, really, there just aren't enough quarter pounders with cheese, and what have we got instead? Knowledge that we're not sure will even be used in our adult lives, or an automated paycheck that enters our bank accounts once a month and then seems to just evaporate under the pretense of paying bills. Our ancestors hunted antelope, and you know what would happen if they failed? They went hungry. And you know what happened when they succeeded? Well, they took that antelope, cut it up into some nice round patties, put it above the fire to cook for a bit, and then turned it into a juicy quarter pounder with cheese. And I bet it tasted fucking delicious. Still, now it's 2022, and you're too lazy and stupid to hunt antelopes, but you could make a hunter and start leveling up in World of Warcraft, where every quest you complete, an enemy you kill, gives you a little bite-sized chunk of experience points, and they're not abstract at all. You can see them on the screen appearing as easy to comprehend numbers, all while you watch a progress bar creep higher and higher with every act you take. And you do know what the use of these experience points is because you know experience points turn into levels, and those unlock new abilities, and those let you kill stronger enemies, and those give you better gear through quest rewards, and those let you group up with other players to fight stronger enemies, and those give you even better gear, and it just keeps going. This is progression, and while it's not unique to MMOs, they do it bigger, better, and on a much more permanent basis. Now, this might seem like some nefarious trick companies use to exploit our vulnerable human psychology, but really it's pretty normal. Much of people's enjoyment of video games comes from overcoming challenges and making some form of progression, whether that be narratively, mechanically, or otherwise, and MMOs are no different, even if they are doing it more deliberately and on a greater scale. And it is important to recognise the extent of that scale, as this is something those unfamiliar with the genre may fail to appreciate. For example, do you know how long it took to get max level in the original vanilla World of Warcraft? It was about 10 days, but that's not 10 days of average play. We're not talking some casual 5 or 6 hours a day bullshit. No, it took 10 days of consecutive game time, 240 hours total, but that's if you were efficient. And if you're a modern day player with access to modern day guides and resources, who also has experience of other MMOs, you may well be quite efficient, but people weren't modern players when WoW first released. So what you really need to consider is how long it would take the average player in 2005, and the average player in 2005 was many things, but efficient wasn't one of them. In fact, a lot of people had never even played an MMO before. They didn't know about tanks, healers, and DPS, they didn't know about following rotations of abilities to maximize damage, they didn't know that some loot wasn't meant for their class, and they didn't know about looking up quest solutions on Thoughtbot or other more modern alternatives. Instead, they just played the game, very badly, and it was a beautiful, wonderful time. Talk to people who played back then and you'll find stories of players who took hours and hours to realise that you can go to a class trainer to learn new abilities or improve existing ones, or players who didn't know you could spend talent points, or players that never realised you could buy or sell things on the auction house and so just vended everything. And those are the more common tales you'll hear. Some of the more unusual include players who didn't know you could move abilities from your spellbook to your hotbars, and so just played the game with the spellbook open at all times, clicking abilities within it to use them. Or players who went to an inn to get rested XP after every single quest to ensure every quest gave bonus experience points. Or warriors using intellect gear because they wanted their character to be more intelligent. Or rogues using skinning knives as their main hand weapon, and so on. Hopefully you get the idea. Are all of these stories true? Well, probably not. I found most of these online just now when I was writing this, and you know what they say about things you hear on the internet. Still, all of these are at least plausible, because people really were that clueless. The thing is though, the more clueless you were, and the more mistakes you made, and the longer everything took, and the more you had to struggle, well, that all just meant the reward was that much sweeter. And, as a great philosopher once said, even though every single person might start as a noob, no one remains that way forever. Because, for all your past failures, your shameful mistakes, your shocking levels of ignorance, if you did keep going, the day would come where your game knowledge could fill libraries, where your list of achievements would be too long to count, and where your skill level could make you feel like a god. And when that day did come, you would feel great pride about where you started and where you ended up. Progression is fun, but World of Warcraft's journey didn't just stop at max level. If anything, reaching level 60 was where many considered the real game to begin, for just as in EverQuest, the game which so heavily inspired it, World of Warcraft also put a large focus on grouping up with other players to take down challenging foes and earn better gear, which culminated in raids, the toughest challenges for the largest groups, which offered the greatest rewards. But you couldn't just level to 60 and then jump into any old group to clear all content. Back then, raids were anything but accessible. They were more like places of myth and legend, something you hear about in passing early on without ever really understanding, but you'd then go on to hear about over and over, more and more, the closer you got to being able to try them, but even then, they still remained out of reach for most of the player base. In a way, these raids represented the very end of the player's journey, and yet most players didn't even get to step foot in them, let alone beat all of the bosses and raids that were available. All you could do is listen to the stories of what they were like, and imagine that you were a part of them. But if you did try hard enough, or tried for long enough, one day that would change. One day you would be able to find the right guilds and get your chance. And after so long looking up at these people in the best guilds with the best gear killing the hardest bosses, now you would get to see what it's like to be one of them. And suddenly those old bosses that you used to think were hard, that your old guild would wipe on for days and days without ever killing, now with your new guild you'd be able to kill them in a single attempt, all while everyone's joking around on voice chat as if this is just the easiest thing in the world. And the new bosses, the ones only just released, the ones most of the player base will never even see, well, you're there, night after night, week after week, fighting and defeating the bosses that most other players can only dream of killing. And now, somehow, you have become a part of the myth and legend. Now, other people you've never even heard of whisper you, asking you what it's like doing the new raid, and when you walk through town, you notice everyone inspecting you, checking out your gear, wishing they were in your place. But that's not even the best part. Do you know what the best part is? It's the other people in your guild. You see, you thought the people in these types of hardcore guilds were just no-lifing losers, people who played the game way too much, who took it way too seriously, and who looked down on those less skilled. And you know what? They are. But the thing you never realized is that deep down, so are you. And now you don't feel weird for being a loser, for playing too much, for taking the game too seriously. Now you just feel at home. And making friends has never been easier, and through these friendships you gain a strong sense of self-worth, because other people value you. For your skill in game, your ability to help them out, and for the fact that you're actually a pretty fun person to be around. And that sense of self-worth turns out to be the greatest achievement of them all. And as for the actual raids themselves, or what the gameplay of these boss fights is like, you know, the stuff you actually spend so many hours doing, how is that, you might ask? Well, does it even matter? You see, as with many things in life, destinations come and go, but what really counts is the journey. And that magical first time, your first time playing an MMO, your first time losing yourself in another world, learning and improving, failing and dying, travelling 40 zones across 60 levels, 240 hours minimum of grinding out quests, only to reach max level and discover a whole new set of challenges await you, and then finding out that you just can't do it alone. You need other people, you need a guild, you need friends, but it's still not enough. You need to get better gear, better at playing your class, better at understanding enemy boss fights, but that's still not enough because now you're being held back by your situation. So, you need a better guild, but the good guilds won't take you, so now you need to find a way to prove yourself. So, you have to get even better at the game, and make more friends, and keep improving your gear and your knowledge, and sticking at it in times when so many others would give up, until one day, possibly years and years after you first started playing, you finally make it, and it feels fucking amazing. And you're able to share that feeling with the friends you made along the way. That right there is what World of Warcraft was all about. It's what it did so well and what other MMOs have since tried so hard to emulate. And it was fundamentally all about that journey. Think of it like climbing a mountain. Now, if you were to break it down, climbing a mountain would seem boring and possibly easy. After all, you just put one foot in front of the other, and even when conditions are tough, each individual step is simple and manageable. But it's not just one or two steps, it's an entire fucking mountain, and you have to zoom out and look at it in its entirety or you won't understand that. So, yeah, each individual quest in an MMO, each time you're asked to kill 15 wolves or gather 10 boar livers, yeah, they are easy and boring, but it's not about the individual quests, or even zones, or bosses, or raids. It's an entire goddamn mountain. And people enjoyed climbing it. Of course, the other thing about mountain climbing is that it isn't that important in the grand scheme of most people's lives. I mean, we don't need to climb mountains to survive in the modern world, and there's no real tangible reward for getting to the top. But for some people, it's as simple as if they see a mountain, they want to climb it. And it's often less about proving something to other people, and more about proving something to yourself. And it doesn't matter that you're not gaining a useful real-world skill set or any physical reward. For some people, if they see a mountain, they just want to climb to the top. Our ancestors hunted antelope, and we don't need to do that anymore, but if there is a benefit to that change provided by our modern lives, it's that we get to create our own challenges and find fulfillment in the things we enjoy. And whether that's elite level raiding, or something else in an MMO, or some other type of video game, or hundreds of other things that aren't supposedly that important and don't technically improve our lives, then who's to say any of that is wrong? I mean, I know that many people will look at MMOs and look at what people do in them and say the same things people have been saying since World of Warcraft first brought the genre into the mainstream. which is that it's all pointless. It's all just one big waste of time, that these worlds aren't real, but your accomplishments in them don't matter, that one day the servers will be shut down, and that playing an MMO is just a mistake made by losers and fools, people either too stupid to see the pointlessness of their virtual actions or too desperate to run away from reality to be able to admit it. But that's wrong. The cold hard truth is that one day you will die, and only two things will matter. The first is that you are a good person, and the other is that you enjoyed the limited time you had. And if that means living your entire life chasing money and status, living that CEO mindset, gotta be your own boss, wake up at 5 AM and grind every day, bro, then fuck it, do it if that's what makes you happy and fulfilled. But if what makes you happy is playing MMOs, if it's climbing that metaphorical mountain, then fuck what other people think. Happiness is the real goal, and for me personally, the happiest memories of my life come from playing MMOs, and I wouldn't change that time for anything. Still, as much as I want to carry the MMO banner and shout to the heavens about the great side of this genre, I did say in the very first line of this video that this is both the greatest and worst genre in gaming, and this story is only halfway told. You see, there's something else you need to understand about climbing a mountain, which is that while getting to the top is amazing, it also means that once you've had some time to admire the view and pat yourself on the back, well, after that, there isn't really anywhere else left for you to go. The golden age of MMOs is not yet recognised as a real historical era, but if it were, I think we could probably agree the most suitable endpoint would have to be the conclusion of World of Warcraft's second expansion, Wrath of the Lich King, in 2010. This was the point where World of Warcraft's subscriber count reached its zenith, with 12 million concurrent players. And this might also be the point where the most consecutive MMO players reached the top of that metaphorical mountain for the very first time, by defeating the Lich King atop his home of the Ice-Crown Citadel. This was the, at the time, hardest and of all time, most hyped boss in World of Warcraft's history, and unlike the end bosses of the base game or the first expansion, which most players didn't even come close to defeating, in Wrath of the Lich King, WoW had taken a number of steps to make the game more accessible, including multiple raid sizes and difficulties, and more ways for players to catch up in gear, resulting in record numbers of players making it to that mountain summit to revel in their glory, and then wonder where exactly they go from there. And Blizzard did have an answer. Cataclysm, the next expansion, featured a new world-threatening enemy for players to take on, and would go even further than previous expansions by changing many of the game's old zones, in what was basically a lore-convenient way for the developers to modernise much of the older leveling experience. This made it quicker, easier and more accessible, and this would be pretty symbolic for the direction modern World of Warcraft would take from then on, for as the years went on, they brought with them more changes of this kind, from the overall design philosophy behind the game to server infrastructure or minor quality of life enhancements, all with the objectives to make the overall experience quicker, easier and more accessible. The most notable of these include the automated looking for group tool, which replaced the need to look for party members manually in-game. New, easier difficulty options for raid content to help get even the most casual players to step foot into raids, and new cross-server technology which would finally allow players to play with whoever they wanted, regardless of the arbitrary limitation of which server someone chose when they first began. In short, it was a new age for Azeroth, and many other MMOs would either follow suit or try to beat Blizzard at their own game by introducing their own new attempts towards accessibility and convenience, which World of Warcraft would often later incorporate anyway. Still, not everything became easier, for if there was one thing this new approach never extended to, it was high-end raiding, which, on higher difficulties, would only get harder and harder as Blizzard continued trying to create higher and higher mountain peaks for the player base to scale. The problem with this, however, was that the true greatness of past MMOs came from the entire experience, beginning with that sense of journey and discovery that comes with starting as a fresh level 1 player, possibly new to the entire genre, and so simply slapping a new raid on top as a new form of hardest content doesn't recreate all the joy that comes from your first time climbing the mountain. So, if Blizzard were going to keep their subscription numbers going up, it's clear it would take more content than just new raids. They would need entire expansions worth of new stuff to do, with new zones to level in, new classes and races to play as, class changes to add higher skill caps, new dungeons, new PvP maps, new collectibles, and, of course, new raids as well. A mountain must have its summit. Still, even then this would prove not enough, for one simple reason, one little problem, one secret we haven't come to yet about the people who play these games. Which is that MMO players don't really play these games in much the same way that a swarm of locusts doesn't really play with a field of crops. They simply fucking devour them.
An adult locust eats its entire body weight every day, and a whole swarm can consume literally hundreds of tons of vegetation. They have to keep on moving. The swarm travels with the wind. It's the most energy-saving way of flying. As they fly, swarms join up with other swarms to form gigantic plagues several billion strong and as much as 40 miles wide. They will consume every edible thing that lies in their path. This is one of planet Earth's greatest spectacles. It's rarely seen on this scale, and it won't last long. Once the food has gone, the steady roar of a billion beating locust wings will once again be replaced by nothing more than the sound of the desert wind.
If you want to understand this genre of games and how it changed with time, maybe no single point is more important than this. So, write this down in your notebooks in big, bold writing. It doesn't matter what content an MMO might have, or what content an MMO might add. It is not enough. It is never enough. And the day will come when it has been consumed. When the fields that were supposed to feed thousands are gone, ground into dust to be carried away with the wind, leaving no trace there was anything here in the first place. And what happens then, you might wonder? Well, then the locusts complain that there is nothing to do, or they unsubscribe and go looking for new pastures, anywhere untouched by the devastation they will bring. It's hard to say whether MMO players were always like this, and that changes in game design, alongside community-based knowledge sharing like internet guides, YouTube videos and add-ons, simply allowed the player base to show its true colours, as a biblical level plague of pure, unstoppable consumption. Or whether it is in fact actually the game designers who are at fault, and that over time they inadvertently corrupted the once innocent players through their never-ending carrots-on-a-stick approach to rewards, alongside the natural thrill of competition, which meant players were always trying to improve their own characters while trying to do so quicker and more effectively than every other player doing the exact same thing. Regardless, in the end, it doesn't matter who's to blame. It's just the way it is. And so, when new expansions are released, players race to max level as quickly as possible. When new gear upgrades are available, players farm whatever they need until that gear is theirs, and when new challenging content is added, players minimize their weaknesses and maximize their strengths to be as effective as they can be, using optimized rotations of abilities, best in-slot gear lists, written or video guides for boss mechanics, and even new add-on programs to assist with the way people actually play the game, like by using audio and visual cues during boss fights, all to clear raids faster, to get the best gear quicker, to maximize efficiency, to climb the mountain faster than everyone else doing the exact same thing. And not only does this ensure new content takes less time to complete, it can also lead to a worse player experience, as people feel forced to rush through new content, or repeatedly run the same dungeons for drops, or play only the meta classes and builds, all as they struggle with an ever-looming threat of falling behind, as everyone else becomes more efficient and optimized, leading to a continuous positive feedback loop as the problem snowballs. You could argue that the fabled golden age of MMOs may only have been a golden age because everyone was bad at these games back then, and this meant the content not only lasted longer, but also provided more enjoyment as there was less pressure to keep up, more choice in classes and builds, and less time and effort needed to be better than other people. And the worse each player was, the greater their individual journey. It was like a perfect storm for player enjoyment, and not only for World of Warcraft but for other MMOs from those earlier days as well. Still, all good things must one day end, and so the MMO player base matured, games moved away from their roots, and often people just ran out of content in MMOs they previously enjoyed, or just got bored of what endgame content there was. All of this combined to create a new phenomenon in the MMO world, one of hype and hope. The era of the next big thing. You see, World of Warcraft's explosive success had done more than just introduce many new players to the genre. It had also proven its financial viability beyond all doubt. Remember, these games didn't just sell lots of copies, they also provided continuous revenue through subscription fees and expansions, which were less impacted by retailer fees, and this was still all in a time before microtransactions, loot boxes, cash stores, and every other successful monetization method players have come to hate. And so, the years which followed World of Warcraft would see many other big budget titles enter the market in hopes of stealing some of that delicious money-printing MMO pie. This meant that regardless of when someone may have started and later got bored of or disillusioned with World of Warcraft, there would always be some new big-name MMO about to come out, which was being touted as the next big thing. People even started going as far as labeling promising new titles "wow killers," based on the belief that this one, this time, will surely be the one to dethrone World of Warcraft. Hell, some games even embraced the idea themselves, like how 2011's Rift would use the phrase "you're not on Azeroth anymore" in its pre-release marketing, as if World of Warcraft was just a joke compared to what it had to offer. And if all that sounds overly ambitious today, well, welcome to hype culture, where there's no such thing as over-ambitious and what you promise is always more important than what you actually deliver. Hype is infectious, and honestly, there was no reason players at the time shouldn't have got excited for new games. After all, World of Warcraft basically came out of nowhere and took over the entire genre overnight, so why shouldn't future games be able to replicate or even surpass its level of success? There was no reason to think the genre had already peaked. Graphics and technology were always evolving. Future games had the ability to learn from those which had come before them, and with settings like Lord of the Rings, Warhammer, or Star Wars, it was hard to believe that these games wouldn't be massive successes. Most of all though, people just wanted the next big thing to be real. They wanted to believe that the MMO genre was only going to get better and better, that we were only just seeing the start of some glorious gaming revolution. And it didn't even matter if you liked World of Warcraft or not, because if you were bored of WoW, then you wanted the next big thing to replace it, to provide something new for you to enjoy. And if you still liked WoW, then the next big thing, in theory, promised to be even better, so you stood to gain something you might like even more. Everyone stood to benefit from this idea, so everyone believed in it. And so the hype spread. Our first real next big thing contender was 2007's Lord of the Rings Online, which came in hard with one of the greatest fictional settings of all time and launched to very positive reviews, gaining particular praise for its faithfulness to its source material and attempt to bring Middle-earth to life. Still, it wasn't enough, perhaps because it launched a little too early and so was competing with WoW when WoW was truly in its ascendancy, at a time before many WoW players actually had a chance to get bored yet. And so it failed to come close to 1 million subscribers before eventually going free-to-play in 2011. Our next contender was 2008's Age of Conan, which did manage to generate an impressive amount of hype, shipping 1 million copies at launch and reaching 700,000 concurrent subscribers. It received praise for its high-quality visuals and cinematic storytelling that featured dynamic camera angles and frequent voice acting, as well as its more unique and action-focused gameplay. But it was also notoriously buggy at launch, with frequent server instability preventing people from actually playing, and endgame was also a little light on content. This led to a quick drop-off in numbers before it too ultimately went free-to-play in 2011. Next, just a few months later, was Warhammer Online: Age of Reckoning, a more PvP-focused MMO from the same studio as the acclaimed Dark Age of Camelot. Warhammer arrived with even more hype, helping it to reach an impressive 800,000 subscribers, and it received plenty of praise for its large-scale PvP and diverse races and class combinations. Once more, however, it still wasn't enough, leading to a rapid drop in players and Warhammer Online eventually shutting down completely in 2013. Up next was a contender from across the sea, the Korean Aeon, which launched in the West in 2009 with impressive visuals, a proven record of success in Asia, and a large focus on the novel concept of flying. After its Western release, Aeon's total subscriber count crossed the 4 million mark, although most of those were in Asian markets, and it too would see a rapid drop-off following this. It might also be better considered as a lineage killer rather than a WoW killer, and its heavy focus on grinding may not have been what some Western players were looking for, with reviews being less positive than some of the other games in this section. Still, its global numbers were impressive, although that still wouldn't stop it from going free-to-play in early 2012. Next up, from Japan this time, would be Final Fantasy XIV, the spiritual successor to Final Fantasy XI, which launched in 2010 to disastrous reviews, with 49 out of 100 on Metacritic. It was criticised for its outdated systems and poor technical performance, with Game Trailer's review describing it as a, quote, broken, incomplete mess which released before it was finished. And so, unsurprisingly, World of Warcraft turned out to be safe from assassination once more. Final Fantasy XIV would end up being relaunched much more successfully in 2013 as Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn, although I guess I've talked about that game enough in a previous video already. Following this in early 2011 would be Rift, a more direct WoW clone than some of the other games mentioned so far that was praised for its high level of polish and relatively smooth and bug-free launch experience. This helped it to quickly reach 600,000 subscribers, but these numbers would soon drop off, as I guess players must have realised they were not on Azeroth anymore and started heading home. Rift also went free-to-play in 2013. Now, around about here is where a particularly astute observer might have started to realise a bit of a pattern was developing, where big hyped-up MMOs were not, in fact, killing World of Warcraft, and didn't really even seem to be coming close. However, only true unbelievers would give up hope this early. Particularly as around about now, World of Warcraft was starting to look slightly vulnerable for the first time, as its then current expansion Cataclysm brought its first ever decline in subscription numbers, and its next expansion announcement for Mists of Pandaria received a rather mixed reception in late 2011, with some fans feeling its heavy focus on panda people didn't fit into Warcraft's established world. What's more, the following year would feature two of the most promising WoW killers of all time. The first was Star Wars: The Old Republic, a game which might have had more going for it on paper than any other MMO in history. Not only was the Old Republic able to make use of and benefit from being part of one of the largest franchises in the world, it was also being developed by BioWare, who were at the height of their popularity, having won countless Game of the Year awards with Mass Effect 2 just a year earlier. And it was also a continuation of a beloved RPG series, Knights of the Old Republic, and it also had the financial backing of one of the largest publishers in the industry, with Electronic Arts, and was also rumoured to be one of the most expensive video games of all time, and it even had a lot of experienced MMO developers working on it after the EA acquisition of Mythic of Warhammer and Dark Age of Camelot fame. This was just about as many high quality ingredients for success as you could possibly ask for, and initially it seemed the Old Republic was doing everything right. It promised to raise the bar for MMO storytelling with full voice acting for every single quest. And an interview after its reveal also promised it would include more story content than every other BioWare game combined. And its incredibly high quality CGI trailers had even people who didn't care about MMOs interested in it. But then it came out, and surprise surprise, World of Warcraft remained firmly unkilled once more. So what did this game that seemed so destined for success do so wrong? Well, not much, really. It was honestly just a little bit average. I mean, the voice acting and writing for quests was a step above other MMOs, but quest objectives were still the same generic kill X number of enemies and gather Y number of items variety that World of Warcraft first popularised. Combat was similar to the MMO tab targeting standard, but there was some noticeable delay on animations, leaving it feeling notably less responsive than, say, World of Warcraft. And the amount of content on offer at launch was decent, but it was also far behind other already established MMOs. Really, the Old Republic was an okay MMO, but that simply wasn't good enough in this period, because people weren't looking for an okay MMO, they were looking for the next big thing, and the Old Republic's relatively conservative design just left it seeming less than some of the games it was directly trying to compete with. So, Star Wars: The Old Republic would not be the one. But 2012 would have another promising MMO on the horizon, and it was one that wouldn't be making the same mistakes of trying to defeat WoW by copying it. Guild Wars 2 was the sequel to ArenaNet's highly praised 2005 MMO Guild Wars, and it instantly set itself apart from the competition with its more action-focused gameplay, its lack of a subscription fee, its move away from traditional questing to instead focus on map completion and dynamic events, its removal of the holy trinity of tank, healer and DPS, and even its promise of an endgame with none of the usual things MMOs had come to be defined by since World of Warcraft, like the never-ending gear progression or raiding. It also looked, ran and played really well, and early beta feedback was overwhelmingly positive. And so, it seemed that here was the answer the MMO genre had been looking for. A game which wasn't just trying to emulate World of Warcraft's design and hope for similar success, but was instead trying to innovate, to move the genre forward, to be the start of a new age for MMOs, and to truly be the game that everyone had been waiting for. And Guild Wars 2 launched with a bang, selling 2 million copies in its first 2 weeks, and gaining one of the highest Metacritic scores for an MMO of its era. but as players quickly reached max level and easily acquired a full set of max level gear, many found themselves with nothing left to do only 2 or 3 weeks after its initial launch. You see, Guild Wars 2 had succeeded at creating a different type of MMO to either WoW or its various clones, but while some MMO players might dislike gear progression and raiding, many others actually liked those things, and Guild Wars 2's great answer to the MMO endgame question wasn't to remove these things and replace them with something else, it was to simply remove them, leaving nothing there to take their place and giving players no long-term goals to chase. In the end, Guild Wars 2 did add both raiding and a form of gear progression, albeit both done in its own more restrained way, and the game was able to find its own, somewhat niche audience. It even continues to be a successful MMO to this day, which is something that can't be said for most of the games mentioned in this video. It was not, however, the WoW killer of prophecy, and it did not lead MMOs into a new, glorious future. And after both the Old Republic and Guild Wars 2 failed to be the next big thing, some of the more cynical MMO players finally started to realize that maybe there wasn't going to be a next big thing. Still, that didn't stop most fans of the genre from repeating the same old cycle of hope, hype, and disappointment, and the following years would see more MMOs come and go, all failing to live up to the lofty hopes much of the MMO player base had set for them. These included several Korean MMOs, often with new exciting takes on MMO combat, such as Terra, Blade and Soul, Arcade, and Black Desert, as well as a few more big Western titles like Neverwinter, Wildstar, and The Elder Scrolls Online, but as the years went on, the frequency of such games became less and less, until suddenly, around the mid-2010s, there wasn't any new big names on the horizon anymore. And with that, the era of the next big thing was over. Now, as is so often the case when we look at the most important events of human history, one must remember that history is always more complex than those who write about it are able to convey. And, as a famous MMO player once said, all happy MMO player bases are alike. Every unhappy MMO player base is unhappy in its own unique way. So you see, there are lots of reasons for why each of these games didn't become the next big thing they were hoped to be, and each game does have its own complicated story waiting to be unravelled. Still, we can nevertheless see some common patterns when we look at this era which may explain why so many of these games struggled to succeed. Firstly, it should be noted that most of these games did find a lot of success during their launches. World of Warcraft itself didn't gain 12 million subscribers overnight, it grew that gigantic player base over time, and its first few months weren't much ahead many of the more successful MMOs which followed it. The difference was that almost every other MMO of this era just couldn't maintain their player bases, and so never had a chance to build on that initial success. One common reason for this was that many of these games simply launched poorly, with queues to log in, unstable servers, and frequent bugs. So while they may have pulled in enough players, they failed to adequately cope with them when they got there, or create a good first impression. It's also worth considering that World of Warcraft itself launched with less content and more bugs than most people remember, with entire zones left completely unfinished. However, World of Warcraft used its early years to grow and improve, which is a luxury that MMOs which followed it weren't afforded, as they instead had to compete with established games right out of the gates, and in both level of polish and in pure quantity of content, that's something they just couldn't do. Remember, if there is one thing MMO players know how to do, it's consume all content in front of them until there is nothing left, which for most of these games is exactly what happened. And with new big titles coming out every year, as well as new shiny expansions for pre-existing MMOs, this was a time when there was always somewhere else for these players to move on to once the content did run out, meaning establishing a long-term player base in this period was probably just very hard. Secondly, you need to understand that the most obvious draw each of these games had going for it, which were the newer, shinier graphics, may have actually come at a surprisingly heavy cost, as many of these games were reported to require quite demanding PCs to run. Meanwhile, World of Warcraft, or even older MMOs, may have looked more dated, but they also ran on a much larger range of PCs, meaning they were accessible to a much larger audience. The new and improved graphics, as well as other areas of improved presentation, also led to higher development costs, which is reflected in the smaller game worlds and less content of each of these games. Remember, WoW had 40 zones at launch, but if you compare that to even some of the more polished games of this era, you'll see a big difference. For example, Lord of the Rings Online launched with 9 zones, Rift had 11, the Old Republic had 13, and so on, all far below the 40 of WoW. Quality might win out over quantity in many cases, but Locust Swarms might have different standards, and the jump in quality newer MMOs did provide wasn't all that big. The end result of all this was that these games couldn't really compete with World of Warcraft itself, so they weren't able to beat WoW at its own game, and the ones which did succeed tended to be the ones which offered something slightly different. And of course, it needs to be emphasised that World of Warcraft itself wasn't able to satisfy much of its player base for a long period of time, hence why its subscription numbers started to fall and why the next big thing phenomenon actually took off. And if World of Warcraft can't make either enough content or good enough content with the financial backing of 12 million subscribers, how were these new contenders going to be able to do something which even WoW couldn't, with but a tiny fraction of its total player base? Really, the hopes placed upon each of these games was so great that they were basically destined to fail, it's just nobody knew it at the time. The story doesn't end there, however, as once an MMO starts to fail, almost nothing can save it. This is what has come to be called the death spiral, and it works a little like this. Game doesn't have enough content. Therefore, it loses players. Game with fewer players now generates less money, leading to less future content. Less future content leads to fewer players because the game doesn't have enough content, and so the cycle just continues. This positive feedback loop of death is even more extreme for MMOs, however, because once people see their friends leave, they become more likely to leave themselves. And also part of the appeal of MMOs is their longevity and how your actions within them can lead to long-term progression. So if you're unsure on a game's future, then you'll be less willing to invest time and money into it, because why invest these precious things into a game you think is ultimately going to fail? And just as hype is over the top and infectious, the same is true for the opposite. And so, as soon as it became apparent that each game wasn't the next big thing people hoped it to be, each game was then met with an overwhelming wave of negativity and declarations of imminent death that have the potential to go on to become self-fulfilling prophecies as the surrounding negativity pushes more and more players away. And so, once the death spiral starts, it can be very difficult to stop, and many honestly pretty good games of this era suffered as a result of this. Still, as an actual player, this era wasn't a bad time to be an MMO fan. It was a time of hope and disappointment, of new and old, life and death. Most importantly though, it was a time when there were plenty of games to play, and sure, some of them might have changed in ways you didn't like, and some of the newer ones were overhyped, and there was a lot of negativity within the MMO player base. But at least there was also still hope. At least there was also still games. And at least it was a lot better than what would come next. Since the days of Ultima Online, new MMOs had released steadily, year after year, and after World of Warcraft, each new upcoming MMO seemed to arrive atop an unstoppable wave of hope and optimism for the future. But in the end, the next big thing never arrived, and while many players might still have clung to hope, the investors and publishers of the gaming world didn't. And just like that, new MMOs just stopped coming. To put this sudden drought into perspective, WildStar and The Elder Scrolls Online released in early 2014. The next Western MMO to release, excluding smaller indie projects, would be New World in late 2021. That's a gap of over 7 years. And so MMOs went from the genre of the future, something so revolutionary it was once considered a literal threat to society that would enslave untold masses within new virtual worlds with the promise of something better than reality, to just a relic of the past, a curious blip in gaming's history that even at their most lofty peaks still failed to come close to whatever the new big thing there was in the gaming industry today. And as for new big things, there were plenty, and each seemed to eat away at what was meant to make MMOs themselves unique and special. For example, when League of Legends exploded MOBAs into the mainstream, suddenly a lot of people looking for a balanced, competitive, player versus player experience had a much more attractive alternative to MMOs. League of Legends had no subscription fees, it didn't require countless add-ons and macros, you didn't have to grind for hours just to play, and you didn't lose against other people just because they had better gear, so it's easy to see why many players might prefer its take on PvP to that seen in MMOs. Or alternatively, if you wanted, say, shared worlds and unique social interactions, then the new wave of survival games like DayZ and Rust were there to offer a fresh and exciting take on this. Or if you just wanted big open worlds, then now that was something many single-player games were able to provide. And if all that wasn't bad enough, other new titles like Destiny or Warframe were embracing traditional MMO social and progression-related features to create new hybrid MMO-light type experiences to satisfy a new generation of gamers' multiplayer needs. Really, the various different parts which once made MMOs unique were being chipped away and repackaged, often in more accessible, affordable, and modern forms by other new thriving genres, meaning the gaming industry didn't seem to need MMOs anymore. And at the same time as this, some people had also started to question how well modern MMOs were doing at being MMOs. This was supposed to be a genre about living, breathing worlds, about social game design and a sense of genuine community, about stepping foot into a whole new reality and losing yourself in the experience, but a lot of older MMO fans had come to consider the genre as having changed for the worst, and lost many of these important things along the way, usually as a result of the ever-increasing focus on accessibility above all else. For example, in the past, MMOs were designed to force players to work together to progress, and even to level up, but the modern approach was to prioritize the solo experience, with forced grouping being seen as highly problematic. Or where in the past most important content took place within the game's open world, modern MMOs had instead become more and more focused on instanced content, to the point where the world itself often seemed like an afterthought. And so, just as other games started to offer the things MMOs were known for, MMOs themselves seemed to be offering these things less and less. And if worries about game design weren't enough, there was also an even scarier change on the horizon: monetization. The MMO genre wasn't the only part of the gaming industry undergoing evolution. The late noughties and early 2010s saw the rise of downloadable content and microtransactions, with both proving to be devastatingly profitable, particularly when targeted at a loyal, passionate and committed fan base, like, say, those of any long-running MMO. Since the genre's initial inception, subscription fees had been the norm in the West, but many Korean MMOs had already proven the free-to-play with microtransaction model to be highly profitable, and with changes in the rest of the gaming industry, it was perhaps inevitable that existing struggling MMOs and new upcoming titles would look to more modern forms of monetization as the most viable way of creating a profitable game. And early adopters of the free-to-play model found great success. For example, the once failed WoW killer, The Lord of the Rings Online, tripled its revenue after making the switch to free-to-play in late 2010. In time, in-game stores with optional cosmetics like unique outfits and mounts, pay-for-convenience services like level boosts and fast travel options, and important paid premium services like name changes or server transfers all became mainstays of the genre, and now the idea of any modern MMO without these features seems somewhat implausible. And this even came to be true for games which already had a subscription fee as well, because hey, why settle for one or two types of monetization methods when you can have all of them? And so the floodgates were flung open as the line for what is and isn't acceptable became more and more blurry, as pay-to-win options came to be forced on many games' player bases whether people liked them or not. Of course, when it comes to pay-to-win, no MMO developers go harder than those in Korea, where such practices are more accepted by these games' native audiences. But if you just wanted to measure the parasitical progress of paid services and cash store integration, there is no better game to look at than the King itself. World of Warcraft first introduced server transfers in 2006, and this felt like a necessary addition as it allowed people to play with friends who may have started on different realms. This was followed by a name change service in 2007, and then race and faction changes in 2009, with the faction change in particular proving controversial for its potential impact on faction balance. Then in early 2010, Blizzard entered new territory with the Celestial Steed, the first ever purchasable mount, which went on to be followed by many more alongside other cosmetic items like pets. Then in 2013, Blizzard added an actual in-game store to make purchasing these extra items and services that little bit easier, followed by a pricey $60 level boost in 2014, which instantly raised any player character to the start of the latest expansion, thus skipping almost all of the leveling experience. And then in 2015, Blizzard introduced the WoW token, an in-game item you can exchange for gold, meaning players could now freely exchange real money for in-game money. The WoW token is much like the services offered by illegal gold-selling websites that have existed in the shadow of the MMO genre for years, and which Blizzard and other MMO developers have long warned players against using for giving people unfair advantages, destroying the in-game economy, and harming the player base's overall experience. But I guess after new research or something, Blizzard found out that it wasn't actually giving players unfair advantages, destroying the economy, or harming the overall player experience that was the problem. It was just the fact that it was some other person profiting from it. So now that all proceeds were going straight to Blizzard, those other things apparently didn't matter anymore. You might wonder what you can actually buy with in-game money in World of Warcraft, and the answer to that is basically absolutely everything. And all you need to do is log into game to see proof of this, as trade chat is full of players advertising the sale of the best gear, the hardest raid clears, the highest PvP ranks, and so on, all under the innocent name of boosting, where players exchange gold to get other players to accomplish things for them, which is something Blizzard is happy to allow as long as you buy gold from them and not a third-party website. This is as unambiguously pay-to-win as it is possible for a thing to be, and this has become an accepted part of modern MMO life, with the boosting situation only becoming more and more integrated into the World of Warcraft experience. The irony is that when the Celestial Steed, a cosmetic-only mount, was first introduced, it was highly controversial, and there was a lot of community pushback over the fact that players were gaining something in-game for out-of-game money, which players saw as fundamentally unfair, and my god, if only players then could see how bad things would go on to become, then maybe people would have actually been able to do something to stop it. But they didn't, and the result is that these days, buying a WoW token is just a normal part of endgame for many players, and why not? I mean, it only costs $20, which is less than 1 hour of work for many people, and it gives just under 300,000 gold, which is about 10 hours of non-stop repetitive farming in-game. And so the WoW token has surely been a huge financial success, and all for the low cost of forever lowering the sense of value of every single thing players can do or achieve in your game. Still, as bad as things became for the genre, for the people who care about these games, one thing never changed, which was that somewhere, somehow, there was still always hope. Welcome to the dark age of MMOs, a time of disappointment, dissatisfaction, disillusionment, and downright despair, and also a time of never quite giving up. But in such gloomy times as these, where could light even be found? Well, for many struggling gaming genres, the 2010s actually did become a time of optimism, as the rise of indie gaming and digital distribution led to many genres finding new life as part of a new, more diverse indie scene. The problem with this though is that MMOs aren't really suited for the indie lifestyle. After all, part of the appeal of these games is that they're big and pull in lots of people and provide continuous content, and none of those are what comes to mind when you think indie. I mean, for years people had wanted the next big thing, not the next small but still pretty good thing. So relying on the indie scene to provide the answer never seemed that likely, until something else hit the gaming industry.
Hi, my name is Mark Jacobs and I am the co-founder of City State Entertainment.
Hi, I'm Chris Roberts. Ever since I saw Star Wars as a wide-eyed 8-year-old, I dreamt of being a hotshot pilot saving the galaxy or a lovable rogue making my way across the cosmos.
Greetings. I'm Richard Garriott, known to some of you as Lord British, the creator of the Ultima series.
Hi there, I'm Brad McQuaid, Chief Creative Officer of Visionary Realms.
When Kickstarter first introduced gamers to the world of crowdfunding in the early 2010s, the optimism around it was absolutely infectious. Suddenly, industry legends were popping up all over the place to say all the right things to the people who most wanted to hear them, and the things they were saying made sense. I mean, modern games had lost something, and game developers being beholden to large publishers did seem to be limiting these developers. After all, there aren't many people who view the role companies like Electronic Arts or Activision play on the industry very positively. So why not get rid of them? And why shouldn't the players fund the type of games they want developers to make? And why wouldn't you trust industry legends with decades of experience? It was all almost too good to be true, so what could possibly go wrong? Well, the answer is absolutely nothing. I mean, many people forget or just don't know, but crowdfunding did give us some of the greatest games of the last decade. Darkest Dungeon, Factorio, Shovel Knight, Divinity Original Sin, Hollow Knight, even Undertale all got their start through crowdfunding. And yeah, there were some disappointments along the way, but overall, the Kickstarter boom of the mid-2010s was a real success. Except for MMOs, that is. For MMOs, the answer to what could possibly go wrong was apparently absolutely everything, and the overall degree of failure displayed by many of these games was enough to make the Titanic's maiden voyage look like a successful trip. The real tragedy in this is that what was promised really did sound great. To focus on just a few of the biggest examples, you had Camelot Unchained, a large-scale PvP-focused successor to Dark Age of Camelot, headed up by Dark Age of Camelot and Warhammer Online lead designer Mark Jacobs. Or City of Titans, a follow-up to the gone-too-soon superhero MMO darling City of Heroes. Or Star Citizen, a highly ambitious space-focused MMO hybrid from Wing Commander creator Chris Roberts. Or Crowfall, a self-proclaimed throne war simulator from seasoned MMO developers featuring an evolving, fully destructible world and a focus on player-created conflict. Or Shroud of the Avatar, a successor to the now grandfather of the MMO genre Ultima Online from legendary Ultima creator himself, Richard Garriott. Or Chronicles of Illyria, a game where player characters age and die in a dynamic, ever-changing world that is shaped by players' actions. This was just what was promised, however. Here's what actually happened. Camelot Unchained was kickstarted in 2013 with an estimated delivery date of December 2015. How close did it come to meeting this estimated release date, you may wonder? Well, we can't tell yet, because it's still not released, nor does it look to be releasing anytime soon. It did enter its Phase 1 beta in July 2018, and it's still in its Phase 1 beta today, but there were some really credible rumours that Phase 2 would start soon, back in 2019, but I'm sure there's nothing to worry about. Now, while it might seem like developer City State Entertainment might have simply failed to create a game, that's not actually true. It turns out they did make a game, just rather than making the game people wanted and helped fund, which was an MMO called Camelot Unchained, they actually made a lobby-based co-op action game called Final Stand Ragnarok. So, they made the wrong game, but was it at least a good wrong game? Well, with only 7 user reviews on Steam, that's hard to say, but we can look at the Steam user statistics, which show an impressively low 24-hour peak of 0 players and an all-time peak of 3 players. So, Camelot Unchained does seem to be MIA, but don't worry, I'm sure one day something will happen, and if you still believe, you can, of course, continue to give your money via the official website, which continues to raise funds to this day. Up next, City of Titans, kickstarted again in 2013 with an estimated delivery date of November 2015, and again, still not released, still no release date, still not even playable, and still raising funds via its website. I'm not sure any more needs to be said than that. Next, there is Star Citizen, kickstarted in 2012 with an estimated delivery date of November 2014, and again, it's still not released, nor does it have a release date, nor does it seem to be close to having one. Of course, Star Citizen is a little unique in the way it continued to raise considerable funds after its Kickstarter had finished through the sale of in-game ships, leading to it raising over $400 million, making it the second highest crowd-funded project in history, with the only other projects even coming close all being blockchain and cryptocurrency related. Still, $400 million or not, it still wasn't enough to fund a release date, I guess. Moving on to a game that did a little better, we have Crowfall, kickstarted in 2015 with an estimated delivery date of 2016 and an actual, genuine, certifiably real release date of July 2021. Yes, that is in the past. This has actually happened. I repeat, a Kickstarter MMO has released to the public. The future is now. Take that, doubters. Unfortunately, it turns out that releasing a game is really just one step of the process, and apparently it's also important that the game is actually good, which Crowfall wasn't, as it launched with a range of fundamental design flaws like heavy lag every time you open the map. Mostly though, people just didn't care, and didn't play it. A similar story could be told about Shroud of the Avatar, which was kickstarted in 2013 with an estimated delivery date of October 2014 and released on March 2018 to mediocre reviews, with many aspects of the game being considered outdated or inferior to its 1997 inspiration. Once more, very few people actually played it, with Steam listing a 24-hour peak of 53 players and an all-time peak of 600, which was during a beta event before the game even came out. So these games ended up being basically dead on arrival, but at least they arrived, and at least there was a real game being developed with the funds players put forward. Speaking of which, we come to the final game, Chronicles of Illyria, kickstarted in 2016 with an estimated delivery date of 2017, which went on to be cancelled in 2020. Fair enough, you might say. I mean, anyone who knows the gaming industry knows some games do get cancelled, not everything works out, it happens. One little problem with this example, however, is the $8 million of player money that was given to fund the game, which, according to the developer, had all been spent. And apparently it's hard to refund something if there's no money left. There also wasn't really much game to show for those funds either, leading many to label Chronicles of Illyria as a scam. A class action lawsuit was later filed and is currently still ongoing, which isn't exactly a great indictment for one of the premium crowd-funded MMOs, and this isn't even the only example of something like this happening, which honestly rather sums up the great Kickstarter MMO revolution. Many of these games really did sound good on paper, but the results have been extremely long development times, with the end product bringing nothing but resounding disappointment. So, why did Kickstarter work for so many games but so few MMOs? Well, the answer probably has to do with the types of games being kickstarted. Most of the success stories that came from crowdfunding were small indie games where the money pledged on Kickstarter could fund a large chunk of their development. But for a big MMO, even the $1 or $2 million of the most successful MMO Kickstarters is basically nothing. For comparison, Star Wars The Old Republic had a budget of around $200 million. MMOs are expensive, and pretty much all of these new games were also very ambitious in one way or another. So it didn't really matter how much they raised on Kickstarter, it just wasn't enough. Meaning they either had to secure additional funding, or just accept that they were unable to deliver their lofty promises in a realistic time frame. And the thing about game development for many larger projects is that the longer it drags on, the more costs will accumulate, the more other problems crop up, and the more members of staff leave and need to be replaced. And basically, there's a reason it's called development hell rather than development long relaxing vacation or something. Of course, this is all very obvious in hindsight, but when these Kickstarters first started popping up, they were met with overwhelming positivity and optimism. Basically, everyone believed in these projects because they wanted their promises to be real, not because they were actually realistic, and that's not surprising when you consider how few other games there were to look forward to in this period. And if that wasn't enough, this era also saw a number of high-profile cancellations of other upcoming MMOs. The most devastating was surely EverQuest Next, a game once heralded as the future of the genre that focused heavily on player-created emergent content and came with an intricate voxel-based construction kit that would allow players to shape their world like never before. And it was cancelled in 2016, roughly 4 years after its announcement. Other painful cancellations include the World of Darkness MMO from the creators of EVE Online in 2014, the visually dazzling Project Copernicus that was quietly cancelled in the early 2010s, and of course Project Titan, an ambitious next-generation MMO shooter from no other than Blizzard Entertainment themselves, which was cancelled in 2013, with Blizzard instead deciding to make the somewhat less ambitious but still hugely successful Overwatch instead. And so, with nowhere to look to in the future, more and more MMO fans instead started to look to the past. Unofficial private servers running different versions of popular MMOs have been around since the early 2000s. Once upon a time, these servers focused more on providing fun, custom experiences with unique rule sets, and were a bit like playing an MMO with cheat codes enabled, or were instead just popular because they were a free alternative to games that otherwise required a subscription. With time, however, more and more private servers appeared that instead focused on accurately preserving past versions of popular games. The most famous of these was Nostalrius, a private World of Warcraft server which offered a patch 1.12 version of the original pre-expansions World of Warcraft. Nostalrius launched in early 2015 and was shut down about a year later, after Blizzard issued a cease and desist letter for copyright violation. Still, within that year, Nostalrius accumulated over 800,000 registered accounts and had become hugely popular with a subset of the World of Warcraft community, meaning its closure brought widespread opposition from a number of YouTubers, Twitch streamers, gaming outlets, and even one of the original World of Warcraft designers. And just when Nostalrius was gaining popularity, EverQuest also launched its first official progression server, which recreated the 1999 version of the game for the EverQuest player base, and was highly successful, leading to many future EverQuest progression servers in the years following. Another MMO, RuneScape, had went even further with their version of old-school RuneScape, which released in 2013 as a faithful recreation of the 2007 version that was offered as an alternative to the more modern RuneScape 3. Old-school RuneScape would go on to receive continual development by way of updates and new content, and maintains a larger player base than the newer version of RuneScape to this day. So, it was no surprise that Blizzard would go on to announce their own version of a WoW vanilla experience with World of Warcraft Classic, which released in 2019 to allow players all over the world to finally relive, or just experience for the first time, World of Warcraft's glory days. This led to WoW's subscriber base more than doubling by the end of 2019, in what was one of the biggest events in modern MMO history. So, WoW Classic was hugely successful, but what this said about the genre was less positive, as not only did this highlight the extent of just how rare big events were for the world of MMOs these days, it also raised questions over the direction the genre had taken. For years, many fans had been saying MMOs were better in the past, and that many of the changes that were meant to improve these games had actually made them worse. And for years, other MMO fans had said this perspective was wrong and just a result of nostalgia, something perfectly encapsulated by a moment at BlizzCon 2014, where a World of Warcraft fan raised the question of introducing legacy servers at a Q&A with a panel of developers, leading to a now infamous response from future Blizzard president J. Allen Brack.
No. And by the way, you don't want to do that either. You think you do, but you don't. Remember when you had to spam cities and say, need a tank, need a tank, need a tank during the Burning Crusade days? You don't remember that because now you just push a button that says go to the dungeon. You don't want to do that.
Now though, this nostalgia goggle theory was being actively put to the test, and while the results did vary from person to person, one thing Classic did confirm was that it wasn't just the result of nostalgia. You can prefer whatever game or era you like, but it's just not possible to compare World of Warcraft in its now 15-year-old state to how it was originally, and not see that there are things the original did far better than its modern counterpart or countless other modern MMOs, and those things include some of the most important aspects of the entire genre, such as creating a believable and immersive world that players feel a part of, or creating a genuinely social experience. World of Warcraft Classic was proof that something had been lost and some things were better in the past. Unfortunately, World of Warcraft Classic would also prove that the past isn't something you can return to, no matter how much you might want to, For while the game itself was largely unchanged, the player base wasn't. As my old raid leader used to say, no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it is not the same river, and he is not the same man. You see, World of Warcraft Classic was effectively a solved game, which means that all of its content had already been cleared, all its mysteries already uncovered, and all of its problems already solved. And if that's not enough, the player base itself had become more accustomed to solving problems and playing effectively with every year that passed since World of Warcraft first came out. This is best displayed in its raid content that was once considered brutally challenging and went uncleared by all but the most dedicated players, yet now was cleared easily by pretty much anyone who tried. For example, it took 90 days for the first group in the world to clear the final raid, Naxxramas, after its release back in 2006, whereas it took 1 hour and 23 minutes for the same to happen in Classic. 90 days versus 1 hour and 23 minutes really about sums up the original versus Classic experience rather aptly. And without that long, slow climb to the top of a once uncharted mountain to keep players busy, the modern player base instead descended on the game with their locust swarm mentality until they'd devoured all content that was available and were left unhappily looking for their next meal. And so for most, World of Warcraft Classic was a pleasant trip down memory lane, or a unique opportunity to experience one of gaming's greats. But for the MMO genre, it would not be the next big thing, for it was simply the past big thing brought back from the dead. So, where does that leave the MMO genre? You may think that after so many years of delays, disappointments and cancellations, that the concept of the next big thing would at least finally be dead and gone from the MMO world. But it's not. In fact, right now one particular contender seems to have had more hopes placed upon it than any other MMO in history, which might be because it's basically the only possible contender left. Ashes of Creation describes itself as the rebirth of the MMORPG, the game which will put massively back into massively multiplayer and take the genre into a bold new future. And Ashes of Creation does have a lot of interesting features. The game clearly has potential. It's also another MMO funded through crowdfunding, which quickly ended up behind schedule and still doesn't have an actual release date. So make of Ashes what you will. I don't feel there's much point in trying to predict the future when time will tell its own tale in due course, but I will say that what has been shown does look good, and that I at least feel confident that Ashes will turn out better than most of the other once promising Kickstarter MMOs. But whether it will live up to the lofty expectations that come with being the next big thing is a whole other question, and let's just say that if it doesn't, it certainly won't be the first. And, of course, we must also acknowledge that beneath the dominant narrative portrayed in this video of the genre's rise and fall, there have still been many smaller stories of success, even in more recent years. Currently, there are at least 6 MMOs with reasonably sized player bases in the West: World of Warcraft, RuneScape, Guild Wars 2, Final Fantasy XIV, The Elder Scrolls Online, and Black Desert Online. 6 might not sound like a very impressive number, but it's important to keep in mind that almost all of the MMOs which came out of that so-called golden age usually only had about 1 or 2 golden years before they were surpassed by newer games and started to see steep declines in their player counts. But these 6 games, regardless of what you or anyone else might think of them, have each achieved something very few other MMOs ever have, which is that they've continued to stay relevant and release new, high-quality content over a long period of time. So, each of those 6 games deserves credit for managing to find their own audience and keep on going during these darker times. Most of these 6 also deserve to have their own stories told. I just don't have time to do that in this already rather lengthy video. And during the making of this video, those 6 may well have been joined by a 7th, with the long-awaited launch of Lost Ark, a Korean action-focused MMO that's had great success in its home market. It is of course too early to speak for Lost Ark's future, but the number of players it has already pulled in manages to speak for itself, as with an all-time peak of 1.3 million concurrent players on Steam, that makes it the 2nd highest of any game in Steam's history, surpassing the likes of Counter-Strike Go, Dota 2, Cyberpunk and Elden Ring. And Lost Ark isn't the only big-budget MMO released in the last 12 months, as in September of 2021, Amazon Games launched their attempt at the massively multiplayer genre with New World. And while its critical and player reception was admittedly mixed, New World still once more brought in a considerable number of people at launch, with over 900,000 concurrent players, meaning it's only surpassed by each of the games I just mentioned. Maybe neither Lost Ark nor New World were the MMO saviour some MMO fans might have been hoping for, but at the very least, the long MMO drought where no new big budget games were released since early 2016 is now officially over. And what's more, the numbers each of these games produced feels like proof that there is still life in this genre, and that even if many developers and publishers have given up on it, the players haven't. So, even if right now isn't the best time for the MMO genre, it's also not the worst, and there are still reasons to be hopeful, just like there always has been. And I guess that's that. The past has now caught up to the present, and history seems to have become reality. The rest of this story is for the future to tell, and that means my job has finally concluded. Except for the fact that there is still the entire point of this video. I mean, come on, what did you think this was? Entertainment? This is history we're talking about. It's not there to entertain us. All of this means something. So tell me, my wise, attentive students, what have you learnt? It's been over 2 hours now. We have journeyed from the 1970s to 2022, seen successes and failures, experienced the good times and the bad, but what does it all mean? What do these events say? What was the point in all this? Here, let me provide one final clue, a little refresher to help anyone that still doesn't quite get it. Why was it in the 1970s, before the internet even existed, that people still made multi-user online games to share with their friends? And why was it that in 1991, people were willing to pay the equivalent of $12 an hour and put up with long queues, all to play an online game with graphics like this? And why did Richard Garriott decide to go against his publisher's wishes and turn his back on continuing one of the most successful RPG series of all time to instead create the highly risky and completely unproven Ultima Online? And why did the Golden Age boom with new games in new styles and new settings for new audiences, despite how difficult, time-consuming and inaccessible most of these games were? And why did World of Warcraft explode in popularity to become a genuine cultural phenomenon? And why did mainstream media and legitimate academics start talking about MMOs as if they were some new type of dangerous drug that would enslave society? And why did MMO fans spend year after year hyping up the next big thing, despite every sign that doing so only leads to endless disappointment? And why did people give their own money, sometimes up to $10,000 per person, to fund these completely unproven, obviously risky projects on Kickstarter? And why did hundreds of thousands of people want to return to the past so much that they played on private servers that could be shut down any second just to get a chance to do so? And why did people go through the darkest of days where there was no reason to ever be positive and no new games even in sight, and yet still not give up hope? And why did record numbers of people flock to both of the new big recent MMOs, even though everyone knows by now that MMOs have sucked for years? Do you see it now? It's because of that dream of stepping into a virtual world, a shared reality, something bigger than just you and something more than just the game, something that felt real, something that genuinely mattered. The same dream that gave birth to this genre and then took it to new heights and then kept it going through all the tough times. I mean, just face it. It doesn't matter how much people might criticize MMOs or how many declarations of death are made, people still want MMOs. They've always wanted MMOs, even before they ever existed, and they will continue to want them even after the genres went to hell. And despite all of the problems the genres encountered, and every mistake that's been made along the way, and all the things that could have been but weren't, the dream is still there. And that's why MMOs are the greatest genre in gaming. And yeah, they are also the worst. That part's true too, and it always has been. They lead to wasted time, needless repetition, premature closures, and endless disappointments. But somehow, if it clicks, if you find yourself in the right place at the right time, it's all worth it. So, MMOs aren't dead, and you know what? They never will be. The idea behind them is simply too good to just go away. But there is a downside to this, which is that because of this never-ending dream, people will also never stop hoping, and so people will never stop being disappointed, and goddamn has there been a lot of disappointment in recent years. And if MMOs are the greatest and worst genre of all time, the worst side of them does seem like it might be winning the battle right now. In fact, the genre itself seems to be facing a number of existential dilemmas to which almost no one seems to have any answers for. And, I mean, yeah, the dream is great and all, but it still needs someone to turn it into reality. And there seems to be a genuine crisis right now over what exactly these games should be, and what exactly went wrong, and what exactly the solution is. And until a solution is found, the cycle of disappointment and despair seems destined to continue, all while older fans of these games remain trapped in their memories of the past, with nowhere to call home in the present, and nowhere to turn to in the future. Honestly, it kind of sucks. But what if I told you that I actually have the answer to every question, that I have the solution to every problem, and that I know the one thing that no one else does: how to save the MMO genre once and for all? Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about that right now, because this video is already really fucking long. I mean, obviously I planned to include all that stuff. Actually, that was the entire point of this video. That was the important part. The history stuff was just meant to be like an introduction. But, you know, I also planned for this video to only be around 1 hour long, and to be finished well before Elden Ring came out. And look how that turned out. I still haven't played Elden Ring, by the way, and I also don't know what month it is anymore. So, yeah, I guess MMOs will just have to go unsaved for another day. Oh well. Thanks for watching.